On March 14, 1971, at 11:47 p.m., the Whitmore County Sheriff's Department received a call that would remain classified in their records for the next 18 years. The caller was Reverend Thomas Ashford, senior pastor of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Meridian Falls, Pennsylvania, a limestone structure built in 1843 that had served 5 generations of congregants without incident. His voice, according to the dispatcher's log, was described as controlled but shaken. He reported hearing sounds from the church basement. Not mice, not wind, movement, deliberate, human. When Deputy Marshal Kern arrived at 12:03 a.m., he found Reverend Ashford standing in the churchyard, flashlight in hand, refusing to go back inside. The church doors were locked, the windows intact, there was no sign of forced entry. But when Kern descended into the basement, a stone-walled storage space used for Christmas decorations and old hymnals, he heard it too. A scraping sound. Rhythmic, coming from behind the eastern wall. He radioed for backup. Within 40 minutes, 3 more officers, the fire chief, and the county building inspector were standing in that basement, listening to something they could not explain. By dawn, a decision had been made. The basement would be sealed. Permanently. Concrete poured, access denied, no investigation, no excavation, no questions. What they heard that night was never entered into official records. But 50 years later, a single photograph surfaced in an estate sale, showing the inside of that basement hours before it was sealed. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, was a door. A door that, according to all architectural plans, should not have existed. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to hear isn't just a mystery. It's a warning about what happens when institutions choose silence over truth. St. Allen. Augustine's Church sat at the northern edge of Meridian Falls, a coal mining town of roughly 4,000 residents in 1971. The town had prospered briefly in the 1920s, feeding the steel mills of Pittsburgh, but by the time Richard Nixon was president, most of the mines were closed. The young had left, the old remained. The church, like the town itself, had begun to hollow out. Fewer congregants each year, less money in the collection plate, fewer reasons to maintain the building's aging infrastructure. Reverend Ashford had been assigned to St. Augustine's in 1968, a soft-spoken man in his late 40s with a degree in theology from Princeton and a quiet discomfort with rural ministry. His predecessor, Reverend Harold Kinsley, had served for 32 years before dying of a heart attack in 1967. Kinsley had been beloved. Ashford was tolerated. He preached carefully, kept the books balanced, and avoided controversy. He lived alone in the rectory adjacent to the church, a 2-story brick house with a view of the graveyard. The basement was rarely used. It was damp, poorly lit, and smelled of mildew. Ashford ventured down perhaps twice a year, usually to retrieve something for Easter or Advent. The space was roughly 30 feet wide and 40 feet long, with a low ceiling supported by thick timber beams. The walls were original stone, mortared in the 1840s by hands long dead. There were no windows. One staircase led down from the nave. One door at the rear opened into what parishioners called the coal room, a smaller chamber where fuel had once been stored before the church switched to oil heat in 1952. On the evening of March 14th, Ashford had been preparing his sermon for the following Sunday when he heard a sound from below. At first, he thought it was plumbing, an old building settling, pipes expanding. But the sound continued, rhythmic, deliberate. He descended the stairs with a flashlight. The basement was empty. The coal room door was closed, as always. But the sound was louder now. It was coming from behind the eastern wall. Not inside the coal room. Behind the wall itself. He stood there for several minutes, listening. Then he heard something else. A voice. Faint. Indistinct. Not words, just the modulation of a human throat attempting speech. He went back upstairs and locked the basement door. Then he called the police. Deputy Kern's report, filed at 1:14 a.m. on March 15th, described the scene in clinical terms. No evidence of intruders, no structural damage, no obvious source for the sounds. But his handwritten notes, discovered decades later in a storage box, told a different story. He wrote, Heard scraping, consistent interval, approx. 8 to 10 seconds between repetitions, sounded like metal on stone, could not determine origin point. Reverend adamant, will not stay in building. By 2:00 a.m., Fire Chief Roland Pitts had arrived with 2 men and a sledgehammer. They knocked a hole in the eastern wall, expecting to find a gap, a hollow, perhaps an old ventilation shaft. Instead, they found more stone, solid, no cavity, but the sound had not stopped. If anything, it had intensified. At 4:30 a.m., the building inspector, Eugene Hartley, made a discovery. He had brought the original architectural plans from the county archives, blueprints dated 1843, hand-drawn by a surveyor named Edmund Cross. According to those plans, the basement had only 2 chambers, the main room and the coal room. But when Hartley measured the building's exterior dimensions against the interior layout, there was a discrepancy. Roughly 12 feet of space was unaccounted for, hidden, inaccessible. Someone suggested breaking through the coal room's rear wall. Hartley refused. He said the structure was too old, too fragile. Disturbing the foundation could cause a collapse. Instead, he recommended sealing the basement entirely, filling the stairwell with concrete, boarding the door, and forbidding entry. Reverend Ashford agreed. He did not want to know what was behind that wall. He wanted silence. By 9 a.m. on March 15th, contractors were already mixing cement. Meridian Falls had always been a town of secrets. In 1887, a mine collapse killed 16 men, and their bodies were never recovered. The company simply sealed the shaft and moved operations a quarter-mile west. In 1923, during Prohibition, a federal raid uncovered a distillery operating beneath the town's funeral home. In 1954, a schoolteacher named Marion Greer disappeared on her way home from evening mass. Her car was found abandoned near the church, keys still in the ignition, but she was never seen again. The town had learned, over generations, not to ask too many questions. When the basement of St. Augustine's was sealed, the official explanation was structural damage. The church council issued a brief statement citing concerns about foundational integrity and thanking the congregation for their patience. No one protested. No one demanded details. Within a week, the story had faded, but Reverend Ashford did not forget. In the months following the sealing, he began experiencing what he described in his private journal as disturbances. Doors that he knew he had locked would be found open. Objects in the rectory would be moved. Books reshelved in incorrect order, his reading glasses relocated from his desk to the kitchen counter. He heard footsteps in the hallway at night, though he lived alone. Once, he woke to find his bedroom door wide open and muddy footprints leading from the threshold to the side of his bed, then stopping. He mentioned none of this to his parishioners, but he did confide in one person, Dr. Benjamin Carver, a retired physician who had lived in Meridian Falls his entire life and served as the church's unofficial historian. Carver was 81 years old in 1971, sharp-minded but frail, confined to a wheelchair after a stroke. He had known Reverend Kinsley well. He had attended St. Augustine since childhood, and when Ashford came to him in late April describing what he had heard in the basement, Carver's response was immediate and unambiguous. "You should have left it alone," he said. Ashford pressed him for an explanation. Carver refused, but 2 weeks later he asked Ashford to visit him at his home, a small clapboard house on the outskirts of town. There, in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and yellowed newspapers, Carver told him a story that had never been written down. In 1889, St. Augustine's Church underwent a major renovation. The roof was replaced, the pews refinished, and the basement expanded. The project was overseen by a contractor named Silas Drummond, a man known throughout the county for his craftsmanship and his temper. Drummond employed a crew of 8 men, most of them Irish immigrants who had come to Pennsylvania seeking work in the mines. During the excavation of the basement, the crew unearthed something unexpected. A shaft. Not a mine shaft, but something older, hand-dug, reinforced with timber, descending at a steep angle into the earth. No one knew who had built it or why. Drummond reported the discovery to the church vestry, but the decision was made to simply cover it. The shaft was filled with stone and mortar, and the new basement floor was poured over it. The work was completed in November 1889, but by January 1890, 3 of Drummond's crew were dead. One drowned in the Allegheny River, though he was a strong swimmer. Another fell from a scaffold at a construction site in Pittsburgh, a fall that witnesses described as impossible, as though he had been pushed. The third was found in his boarding house, asphyxiated, with no clear cause. Drummond himself died in March 1890. He was 42 years old, healthy, with no history of illness. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as heart failure, but his widow insisted he had been in perfect health the night before. She claimed that in his final days he had become paranoid, obsessed with the idea that something from the church had followed him home. Dr. Carver had heard this story from his own father, who had been a young physician in Meridian Falls at the time. The deaths were never investigated. They were written off as accidents, coincidences. But the older residents of the town remembered, and they knew to stay away from the church basement. When Kinsley became rector, Carver told Ashford, he asked me about the basement once. I told him the same thing I'm telling you. Don't go down there. Don't disturb what's buried. He listened. You didn't. Ashford asked what Carver thought was in the hidden space. Carver shook his head. I don't know, but I know this. Whatever it is, it's been there since before the church was built, and someone went to great lengths to make sure it stayed hidden. Ashford returned to the rectory that evening, shaken but unconvinced. He was a man of reason, educated in theology and history, trained to distinguish folklore from fact. He did not believe in curses. He did not believe in hauntings. He believed in structural engineering, in acoustic anomalies, in the power of suggestion. But that night, he dreamed of the basement. In the dream, he was standing in the hidden chamber, and the walls were lined with names, hundreds of them, carved into the stone. He could not read them, but he knew somehow that they were the names of people who had been forgotten, people who had been erased. When he woke, his hands were covered in dust, fine, gray dust, like powdered stone. He washed them, but the smell remained. Damp earth, old iron, something faintly chemical. He did not sleep again that night. Over the following weeks, Ashford began researching the church's history. He scoured county records, church archives, and historical society files. He discovered that the land on which St. Augustine's was built had a complicated past. In the 1780s, it had been the site of a trading post operated by a man named Josiah Fenton, who was accused of cheating local indigenous tribes and later found dead under suspicious circumstances. In the early 1800s, the land was owned by a physician named Dr. Clarence Oakes, who ran what was described in census records as a private asylum for the mentally ill. Oakes's facility closed abruptly in 1837, and no records explained why. When the church was constructed in 1843, the foundation was laid directly over the ruins of Oakes's asylum. The architect, Edmund Cross, made no mention of this in his plans. But a letter discovered in the Historical Society's files suggested that Cross had objected to the site. He wrote to the church vestry, "The ground is unstable. There are voids beneath. I recommend relocation." His advice was ignored. Ashford also found something else. In 1891, a year after Silas Drummond's death, a journalist named Peter Hollis published an article in the Meridian Gazette titled "The Forgotten Cellar." The article described rumors of a hidden chamber beneath St. Augustine's, where, according to local legend, Dr. Oakes had conducted experiments on his patients. Hollis claimed to have interviewed an elderly woman who, as a child, had lived near the asylum. She told him that Oakes believed he could cure madness by isolating patients in complete darkness for extended periods. Those who did not recover were never seen again. The article caused a scandal. The church denied the allegations. Hollis was pressured to retract the story, and he left town shortly thereafter. No follow-up was ever published. Ashford made copies of everything he found. Then he locked the documents in his desk and told no one. By the summer of 1971, Reverend Ashford had become a different man. He had lost weight. He slept poorly. He avoided the church whenever possible, conducting services with mechanical efficiency and leaving immediately afterward. Parishioners noticed but said nothing. In a town like Meridian Falls, people respected privacy. But on July 9th, something happened that could not be ignored. It was a Thursday evening, and Ashford was alone in the rectory. He had just finished dinner and was reading in his study when he heard the sound again. Not from the church this time, from directly below him. From the rectory's cellar. He froze. The rectory had a cellar, but it was shallow, used only for storing canned goods and old furniture. He rarely went down there. But the sound was unmistakable, scraping, rhythmic. The same sound he had heard in March. He stood, walked to the cellar door, and opened it. The staircase descended into darkness. He flicked the light switch. Nothing. The bulb had burned out. He retrieved a flashlight and descended slowly, one step at a time. The cellar was as he remembered, cluttered, musty, unremarkable. But the sound had stopped. He swept the flashlight across the room, illuminating shelves stacked with jars, a workbench covered in dust, a coal chute that had been sealed decades ago. Then he saw it. In the far corner, behind a stack of wooden crates, there was a gap in the wall. Not a crack, a deliberate opening, roughly 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, partially concealed by the crates. He approached slowly. The opening led into a passage, a tunnel, hand-dug. The walls were shored up with timber, blackened with age. He did not enter. Instead, he returned upstairs, locked the cellar door, and called Dr. Carver. Carver arrived within the hour, accompanied by his nephew, a carpenter named Michael Lorne. Together, the 3 men descended into the rectory cellar. Lorne brought a lantern and a tape measure. When they reached the tunnel entrance, Lorne crouched and examined the timbers. "This is old," he said. 18th century, maybe earlier. Hand-hewn. Carver asked where it led. Lorne crawled into the passage with the lantern. He was gone for less than a minute before he returned, his face pale. "It goes east," he said, "toward the church." Ashford asked if it connected to the church basement. Lorne nodded. "I think so. But there's something else. There's a room, midway. It's been sealed from the inside." The 3 men did not enter the tunnel that night. Instead, they returned to Carver's house and discussed what to do. Carver was adamant. The tunnel should be filled in, the rectory cellar sealed, and the matter forgotten. Lorne agreed, but Ashford could not let it go. He wanted to know what was in the sealed room. He wanted to understand why it had been hidden. "Understanding won't change anything," Carver said. "Some things are buried for a reason." But Ashford had already made his decision. The next morning, he called Eugene Hartley, the building inspector who had overseen the sealing of the church basement. Hartley listened to Ashford's description of the tunnel, then asked a single question. "Do you really want to know what's down there?" Ashford said yes. Hartley sighed. "Then I'll tell you, but you won't like it." Hartley had grown up in Meridian Falls. His grandfather, William Hartley, had been the town's undertaker in the late 1800s. William kept meticulous records, ledgers detailing every burial, every casket, every payment. After his death in 1943, those ledgers were passed down to Eugene. Most were mundane, but one, dated 1889 to 1891, contained entries that had troubled Eugene for years. During that period, William Hartley had buried 17 people who were listed only as ward of the state. No names, no next of kin, no cause of death. All were buried in unmarked graves in the Potter's Field on the western edge of town. Eugene had always assumed they were inmates from a nearby prison or patients from a county poorhouse. But when he cross-referenced the dates with county records, he found no corresponding institutions. Then, in 1968, while conducting a survey for a proposed housing development, Eugene discovered something. The Potter's Field was located directly above a network of tunnels, old, hand-dug, predating the town itself. The tunnels had been known to early settlers, used briefly for storage, then abandoned and forgotten. But according to a map Eugene found in the county archives, one of those tunnels ran directly beneath St. Augustine's Church. Eugene had never told anyone. He saw no reason to. The tunnels were unstable, dangerous, irrelevant to modern life. But after Ashford's call, he pulled the map from his files and brought it to the rectory. The tunnel connected 3 points: the Potter's Field, the church, and the site of Dr. Oakes's asylum. And in the center, where the 3 paths intersected, there was a notation on the map, a single word written in faded ink: infirmary. If you've been following this story, you understand by now that some histories aren't meant to be uncovered. They're meant to warn. Right now, think of someone you know who needs to hear this. Tell them this sentence: some doors were sealed for a reason. Leave it in the comments. I want to see how many of you are paying attention. On the evening of July 12, 1971, 4 men entered the tunnel beneath the rectory: Reverend Ashford, Eugene Hartley, Michael Lorne, and a freelance photographer named David Mallory, who had been hired by Ashford to document whatever they found. Each carried a flashlight. Lorne brought a crowbar and a sledgehammer. Hartley carried the 1889 map. Mallory had 2 cameras and several rolls of film. They entered at 7:15 p.m. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move in single file. The air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of damp earth. The timbers groaned under the weight of the soil above. After approximately 60 feet, the tunnel widened into a chamber roughly 10 feet square. The walls were lined with stone. In the center of the room was a table, wooden, rotted, barely recognizable, and on the table were objects: glass bottles, surgical instruments, leather straps. Mallory began photographing. Hartley examined the instruments. They were medical tools, corroded but identifiable: scalpels, bone saws, clamps. Lorne found something else: a ledger, water-damaged and illegible except for 1 page. On that page were names, 12 names. Beside each name was a date and a single word: expired. Ashford asked if any of the names matched the church records. Hartley shook his head. These were not members of the congregation. These were patients. At the far end of the chamber, they found a door. It was wooden, reinforced with iron bands, and sealed with a heavy beam wedged into brackets on either side. Lorne removed the beam. The door did not open. It had been nailed shut from the other side. He used the crowbar. The wood splintered. The door swung inward. The room beyond was small, no more than 8 feet by 8 feet. The walls were stone, the floor was dirt, and in the center of the floor was a shape. At first, they thought it was a bundle of cloth. Then Mallory's flashlight caught the outline of bones. It was a human skeleton, curled into a fetal position. The skull was intact, facing the door, and around the skeleton's wrists and ankles were iron shackles, bolted into the stone walls by chains that had rusted into brittle fragments. Ashford knelt. He did not touch the remains. He only looked. Then he stood and said quietly, "We need to call the police." Hartley stopped him. "If you do that, this becomes an investigation. The church will be closed. The town will be torn apart. Are you prepared for that?" Ashford hesitated. Mallory continued photographing. Lorne examined the shackles. He said, "These weren't made to restrain. They were made to display. Look." He pointed to notches carved into the iron. Tally marks. Hundreds of them. Hartley knelt beside the skeleton. He had been a medic in World War II. He knew how to read bones. After several minutes, he stood. This person was young, late teens, early 20s, female. Based on bone density and the state of the teeth, she was malnourished, severely, for years. Ashford asked how long she had been here. Hartley shook his head. Decades, maybe longer. Mallory asked if they should remove the remains. Hartley said no. If we move her, we destroy evidence. If we leave her, we're complicit. Either way, someone will have to answer for this. They stood in silence. Then Lorne noticed something. The walls of the room were covered in scratches, not random, deliberate. Words, carved into the stone with something sharp. Most were illegible, eroded by time and moisture. But one phrase near the skeleton's head was clear. Let me go home. They left the tunnel at 9:47 p.m. Mallory developed the photographs that night in his makeshift darkroom. The images were stark, undeniable. The chamber, the instruments, the skeleton, the words on the wall. Ashford kept the negatives in a lockbox. Hartley returned the map to the county archives. Lauren told no one, but Ashford could not sleep. He kept seeing the skeleton's skull, the empty eye sockets turned toward the door as though waiting. He kept thinking of the tally marks on the shackles, wondering what they counted. Days, months, years. The next morning, he returned to Dr. Carver's house. Carver was in his study, reading. When Ashford described what they had found, Carver closed his book and looked at him for a long time. "You want me to tell you who she was?" Carver said. Ashford nodded. Carver wheeled himself to a filing cabinet and removed a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, some more than a century old. He handed one to Ashford. It was from the Meridian Gazette, dated October 1837. The headline read, "Asylum Closed Following Allegations." The article described accusations against Dr. Clarence Oakes, who had been operating a private facility for the treatment of nervous disorders and moral insanity. Multiple families had accused Oakes of neglect and abuse. One family claimed their daughter, admitted for hysteria, had not been allowed visitors for over a year. When they demanded her release, Oakes refused, citing medical necessity. The family sued. During the trial, Oakes' staff testified that several patients had died under his care, but no records of their deaths existed. The facility was shut down by court order. Oakes disappeared shortly thereafter. His fate was never determined. Ashford asked about the daughter. Carver handed him another clipping, dated November 1837. It was an obituary. Miss Eleanor Pritchard, age 19, beloved daughter of Samuel and Mary Pritchard, passed from this world after a long illness. Services private, but there was a handwritten note in the margin, added by someone years later. No grave, no service. Father died 1838, heartbroken. Mother institutionalized 1839. Carver said, Eleanor Pritchard was admitted to Oakes' asylum in 1835. She was never released. After the facility closed, her family couldn't find her. Oakes claimed she had died of consumption and been buried in the potter's field. But there was no grave, no record, no body, until now. Ashford asked why no one had searched the asylum grounds. Carver shrugged. They did. But Oakes was smart. He didn't bury his secrets where people could find them. He hid them in places no one would look. That evening, Ashford held a meeting with the church vestry. He told them everything. The tunnel, the chamber, the skeleton, the photographs. He recommended that they contact the state police and allow a full investigation. The vestry listened in silence. Then the senior warden, a retired banker named Gordon Weiss, spoke. Reverend Ashford, we appreciate your diligence, but you must understand the position this places the church in. If this becomes public, we will be associated with a crime we did not commit, on land we did not own, involving people we never knew. The media will sensationalize it. Attendance will drop. Donations will cease. The diocese will intervene. This church, which has served this community for over a century, will be destroyed, not by what happened in 1837, but by what we choose to do in 1971. Another vestry member, a lawyer named Hugh Brennan, added, Legally, the remains are evidence of a crime that occurred before any of us were born. The statute of limitations has long expired. Dr. Oakes is dead. There are no suspects to prosecute. Opening an investigation serves no purpose except to satisfy historical curiosity, and historical curiosity is not a legal obligation. Ashford argued that Eleanor Pritchard deserved a proper burial, that her family deserved acknowledgement, that the truth mattered. Weiss responded, The truth, Reverend, is that this town has survived by knowing when to remember and when to forget. If you insist on pursuing this, you will do so without the church's support. The vote was unanimous. The tunnel would be sealed. The photographs would be locked away. The skeleton would remain where it was. and Reverend Ashford would be advised strongly to let the matter rest. He did not agree, but he did not resign. Not yet. Ashford spent the next 2 weeks in a state of paralysis. He attended to his duties mechanically, delivered sermons he did not believe, and avoided the rectory cellar entirely. But at night, he dreamed of Eleanor Pritchard. In the dreams, she was not a skeleton. She was alive, pale, thin, dressed in a stained hospital gown. She stood at the door of the sealed room, reaching toward him. She did not speak. She only waited. On July 28th, Ashford received a phone call from David Mallory. The photographer said he needed to see him immediately. They met at a diner on the edge of town. Mallory looked exhausted. He had not shaved. His hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. "I developed more prints," he said, "from the room. I thought I'd captured everything, but when I enlarged one of the images, I saw something I missed." He handed Ashford a photograph. It showed the wall above the skeleton, covered in scratched words. Ashford had seen this image before. But Mallory pointed to a section near the top, where the light had barely reached. "Look here, there's a date." She carved a date into the stone. Ashford leaned closer. The numbers were faint but legible. 1836, Mallory said. "If Eleanor Pritchard was admitted in 1835 and the asylum closed in 1837, that means she was in that room for at least a year, maybe longer, chained, in the dark, alone." Ashford asked how she had carved the words. Mallory shook his head. "I don't know, but I found something else." He handed Ashford another photograph. It showed the floor near the skeleton. In the dirt, barely visible, were more marks, scratches, as though she had tried to dig. "She didn't die quickly," Mallory said. "She tried to escape, for months, maybe years, and no one came." Ashford set the photographs down. He asked Mallory what he planned to do with them. Mallory said, "That's why I called you. I don't know. Part of me wants to take them to the press, but part of me thinks, maybe the vestry is right. Maybe some things should stay buried." Ashford said nothing. Mallory continued, "I keep thinking, what if we open this up and nothing changes? What if people look at these photos, feel bad for a week, and then forget? What if Eleanor Pritchard gets turned into a headline, a ghost story, a podcast episode? Is that better than leaving her in peace?" Ashford finally spoke. "She's not in peace. She's in a hole, chained to a wall, surrounded by darkness. That's not peace. That's abandonment." Mallory asked what Ashford wanted him to do. Ashford said, "I want you to keep the photographs safe, because one day someone will have the courage to tell her story, and when that day comes, we'll need proof." On August 3, 1971, Reverend Ashford submitted his resignation to the diocese. He cited personal reasons and requested an immediate transfer. The diocese accepted without question. By August 15th, he was gone, reassigned to a church in Ohio, far from Meridian Falls. He never returned. The tunnel beneath the rectory was filled with concrete. The church basement remained sealed. The photographs were locked in a safe deposit box at a bank in Pittsburgh, where they would remain for 18 years. In 1989, David Mallory died of cancer. In his will, he left the contents of the safe deposit box to his daughter, Rebecca, with a note. "If you think the world is ready, share them. If not, burn them." Rebecca Mallory was a journalist. She did not burn them. In 1990, the photographs were published in a regional history journal under the title The Hidden Room: Evidence of Medical Abuse in 19th Century Pennsylvania. The article included transcripts of Ashford's notes, copies of the 1837 newspaper clippings, and testimony from Eugene Hartley, who had kept his own records. The publication caused a minor scandal. The diocese issued a statement expressing regret. The town of Meridian Falls declined to comment. In 1992, a team of forensic anthropologists from the University of Pittsburgh requested permission to excavate the sealed room. The church vestry refused. The request was repeated in 1995, 1998, and 2003. Each time, the answer was no. In 2007, St. Augustine's Church was sold to a private developer. The building was converted into apartments. The basement, still sealed, was declared off-limits due to structural concerns. The rectory was demolished. The tunnel was buried beneath a parking lot. Eleanor Pritchard was never moved. Her remains are still there in the hidden room, chained to a wall, surrounded by her own words. Today, Meridian Falls is a ghost of itself. The population has dropped below 1,000. Most of the houses are abandoned. The mines are gone. The church is gone. The town square, once vibrant, is now a parking lot surrounded by empty storefronts. But the story of Eleanor Pritchard has not disappeared. It has spread, slowly at first, then faster, carried by historians, journalists, and people who believe that the past must be confronted, not concealed. In 2015, a petition was launched demanding the exhumation and proper burial of Eleanor's remains. It gathered over 50,000 signatures. The current owners of the building declined to respond. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Klein traveled to Meridian Falls to investigate the story. She interviewed former residents, reviewed the photographs, and located the sealed basement. She was denied access, but she did discover something. In the county archives, buried in a box of uncatalogued documents, she found a letter. It was written by Dr. Clarence Oakes in 1836, addressed to a colleague in Philadelphia. In the letter, Oakes described his treatment methodology for patients he deemed incurable. He wrote, "Isolation is the only remedy. The mind, deprived of all stimuli, will either heal itself or extinguish itself. I have observed both outcomes. Those who heal emerge docile and manageable. Those who do not cease to be a burden." The letter was never sent. It was found among Oakes's belongings after his disappearance. Klein included it in her documentary, which premiered in 2019 at a film festival in Pittsburgh. The documentary was titled Sealed. It did not lead to action. It led to awareness. And sometimes, awareness is enough. The question that remains is not whether Eleanor Pritchard existed. The evidence is irrefutable. The question is why she has not been freed. Why nearly 2 centuries after her death, she remains in a room designed to erase her. The answer is both simple and damning, because institutions, even well-meaning ones, prioritize reputation over responsibility. Because silence is easier than reckoning. Because the dead cannot demand justice, and the living grow tired of trying. But every so often, someone hears the story and refuses to let it go. Someone asks the uncomfortable questions. Someone insists that Eleanor Pritchard deserves more than a footnote in a history journal, more than a photograph locked in a file, more than a voice scratching words into stone that no one will read. Her story is not unique. Across America, there are thousands of Eleanor Pritchards, people who were disappeared by systems that claimed to help them, who were buried in unmarked graves, locked in forgotten rooms, erased from records. They were poor. They were sick. They were inconvenient. And so they were silenced. But silence is not the same as forgetting, and a story once told cannot be untold. If you've watched this far, it's because you understand that history is not a collection of dates and names. It's a reckoning. It's a mirror. And sometimes, the reflection is unbearable. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far, so I can get to know you and see who really values the stories we tell here on this channel." And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that the past is never truly past, subscribe, share this video, tell someone who needs to hear it. Because the only way Eleanor Pritchard's voice is ever heard is if we refuse to let it be silenced again. Hit the like button if you believe some truths are worth uncovering, no matter how painful. And remember, some doors were sealed for a reason, but that doesn't mean they should stay closed forever.